I'm here today with Mr. Jim Hahn. It is April 29th at about 2:30 in the afternoon. Mr. Hahn served in the Second World War and has allowed me to interview him. So if you would just begin talking about maybe your younger life and before the war.
My name is James Hahn. I was born and raised in Jefferson County, Montana. Went to grade school in Montana City and Clancy. Went to high school over in Boulder, the county seat of Jefferson County. But I graduated from Helena High because I had thoughts of being a journalist at that time, and they had a class in journalism at that time. However, World War I or II came along, and I didn't want to go in right away, but I graduated in '43, and my younger brother had joined already the Air Force, and my older brother had also joined the Air Force, and he wound up being a bombardier on a B-17, and later perished over Berlin. But my younger brother, Dave, he was a cameraman, photographer, and he returned home just shortly before I did. I stayed at home because my mother wanted one of her sons around, and so I waited, and finally they drafted me, and I headed down to Fort Douglas and Salt Lake, and then from there to Fort Knox, Kentucky, where I became a radio operator. And I went through basic training there, and then to armored school, as they called it in those days. And then I went to Fort George Meade in Maryland for what they called battle training at that time. And then from there I was shipped overseas. I arrived overseas, went overseas in a convoy, probably 20, 30 ships in that convoy, and we were the largest ship. It was an old passenger cruiser from World War I, and the reason we knew that was because some of the carbines were still in the handrails, the wooden handrails that were still in existence on board the ship. Anyhow, off to Southampton, England, and then over to Le Havre, France, and of course D-Day had come and gone quite a while before I got there, but the American troops were in eastern France, and from Le Havre, from a camp in Le Havre, France, I went to Fontainebleau, France, which is just outside of Paris, and stayed at Carroll College. And they had made a replacement depot out of it. And from there, I was trucked to my outfit in Nancy, France, which is this south part of France, and not too far from the German border. From there, I was assigned to the 106th Cavalry Reconnaissance Group, which was made up of armored cars and tanks and assault guns and machine gun bantams and mortars. And from there, of course, I was a radio operator in a armored car, and my first taste of combats came shortly after I joined the outfit. But we went on to Strasbourg, Germany, and Fulda, and Munich, and all this time, I joined the outfit in January, the first part of January 1945. And from there on, I became familiar with what was going on in the war. And it appears that we were assigned to different infantry divisions that didn't have a reconnaissance group with them, like the 3rd Infantry or the 71st or the 45th. And so we were up and down the front lines, but that was the purpose. We were quite mobile and could move from one end of the line to the other. We hold up in our advance on the Maginot Line, which faced the Siegfried Line, which Germany's line of defense. And there I had lots of experience dodging sniper bullets, both in the little village where we would more or less bivouac. I had a command post, and later on sniper fire down through the little village where we had to go, because we couldn't get him on radio. We got one of our patrols, and the officer in charge sent me and another guy down the street to contact him. And all the way down the sniper, it was run for about 5 paces and then dive, and get up and run for another 5 and then dive. And thankfully, the sniper couldn't quite catch us. But earlier, as we stood in where our command post was, it was located between a typical farmhouse in those areas, where the house was on one side and the barn was on the other, and it was all under one roof, and they had kind of a driveway or breezeway in between. And after we set up my radio and stuff, we stood outside to have a smoke, and 2 of us, and while we were sitting there, zoom, a bullet whizzed by, And I looked at him, and he looked at me, and I said, is that a bullet? And he said, yes, I'm afraid so. And about that time, the second one come in, and the sniper, I don't know where he was, but he was using a silencer on his rifle. But that was my best experience, most interesting experience with a sniper. And we holed up in a French pillbox, which was actually 3 stories high, 1 story above the ground and 2 stories below. And it was a French part of the Maginot Line, and it was under artillery fire all the time. You couldn't move without them being without artillery fire coming in on you. Matter of fact, because I had to spend a few hours on the radio every night, when the batteries would run out, we would have to go out to one of the Jeeps and get another battery pack. And if we went out in pitch darkness, they knew it. Then the German artillery was pretty good, and they would throw them in on top of us. I remember one time one piece of shrapnel went through one of the radios and another piece through the battery pack. Anyhow, from there we went on, and I listened on the radio at night to the attacks that the Germans or the U.S. military was making against the Siegfried Line. And finally we broke through where we were at a small German pillbox. And I remember an incident of going through in our vehicles after the infantry had taken that pillbox. Pardon me for the interruption, but in the infantry, which was the 3rd Division, 3rd Infantry Division, they left about 12 or 15 soldiers laying on the ground when we went through, all dead, of course, that had attacked the pillbox. And I wondered at the time how important it was for us to lose those young men to get through the line when the German line was breaking down anyhow, and it probably would have been very few days before. This must have been in March, probably a few months before the end of the war. But when we went on through, and usually a column would be made up of light tanks, assault guns, which was a artillery piece mounted on a light tank chassis, and armored cars. Those were the heavies. And then what they called a machine gun Bantam and a mortar Bantam. the as a sidelight, the cavalry was the first ones that received the Jeep for a combat vehicle, and the first ones were built by a company called Bantam. So the cavalry called them Bantams, and and that unit I was in was one of the first ones that converted from horses to mechanized warfare. Anyhow, one interesting thing was approaching a small German town. Somebody had put a big cardboard sign in English that said, "Please do not fire on our town. There are no German soldiers here." And that was the result of a situation where we were in advance of that, we had run into a small town and went through the small town, and immediately beyond it was a roadblock of fallen trees. Well, we pulled back with our armor, and the engineers went on to remove the roadblock. While we were resting in the town, a bunch of snipers opened up, and they were in basements and on roofs and everywhere in the town. They had really set up a nice ambush for us, and the armored vehicles were okay, but I can remember one of the tank commanders being out of his vehicle, and one of these snipers opened up. I can see him for this day, grabbing his neck where he was hit, but it didn't demobilize him. He did manage to get into his tank. But those snipers all fired for the neck of any soldiers that they killed. And that was something strange. But they didn't really get too many of us. But I guess if you hit a guy in the neck, he did. But that was turned out later that we found out that they were a bunch of what they called Hitler youth, 15, 17 years old, 18, that were Nazi diehards. And I hope you are staying with me with some of this rambling.
Oh no, it's great.
But anyhow, and then next town with the big cardboard, and I can remember too a dead German soldier laying alongside the road, and it looked like he'd been dead for a few days, and of course nobody had taken care of him, and I imagine the townspeople were scared to move. But another interesting spot, I think in the Hart Mountains, a small village, beautiful, I remember it, and our armored column was going through this small village, and we had to stop. And there's a bunch of women and children and very, very old men were lining both sides of the roadway. And this one particular group of women was standing there with their peasant long dresses and their scarves and their little vests and everything, that very, I guess, continental or German or so. But when we stopped and we were looking at those women in their dress, why, one of them steps up and says, "Any of you guys from Brooklyn?" Which really shocked us. Well, the story was that she had a brother that lived in Brooklyn, and she'd been over there to visit him several times. So much for that. Later on, we ran into a terrible mess in a valley in the mountains where the Air Force had caught up with a German artillery outfit, and the German artillery then was being drawn by horses. And I can remember with their bombings and strafings, they killed so many horses and so many Germans. And you think about people, I can remember some of the Germans laying on their backs on the side of the road. And the dust filtering on their open eyes. Just one of those things that you don't see, except in a war situation. Anyhow, that was a bad day. Later on, we came to Fulda. We were attached. My unit was attached to one of the infantry divisions there, and then we went south to go by Munich, and we were following up one of our armored columns or armored infantry, and I counted 6 American tanks knocked out, immobilized, and not one single German tank was. And I thought, my God, the Germans certainly had superior tanks and firepower. But on through Munich and hit the Autobahn, which was a beautiful 4-lane, which, by the way, our interstate is copied after. And the Germans had blown all the bridges. But that wasn't too much of a hamper. Somewhat. Our engineers were so good that they could build a bridge. Well, some people were thinking about it. And on to Salzburg. And we were the first units in the Salzburg. And we had to get into Salzburg through a blown railroad bridge. And spent a few days there, and then on east of Salzburg to a beautiful, but about 15, 20 kilometers east of Salisbury was where I probably come as close as I ever in the whole war to being shot down. And that was when we, out of this town, small town, we chased a small group of Germans out, and they went out the far end of the town, and then you hit a hill and had one switchback, and then you over the hill. Well, they set up an ambush at the top of the hill, and we were the biggest vehicle in the column that was ahead of us, and they fired one Panzerfaust, which is an anti-tank weapon, at our car. Figuring if they immobilized it on that small mountain trail, then they had the rest of the column trapped. Well, fortunately for us, that Panzerfaust hit a tree 10 feet from our vehicle, and my driver had a little dog that rode between us, and the dog went crazy. But our forward units managed to wipe out the ambush, and that was the end of that. Then on to a place called St. Gilgen, and it was on a lake called Wolfgangsee. And our forward elements, we stopped at the near end of the lake at a small village called St. Gilgen, and they went on to the far end of the lake where they liberated King Leopold of Belgium, who was being held there by the Nazis, along with some other political refugees. And that's where we were when the war ended. And from there, we did some patrolling. With the war ended, we patrolled the back country to no avail. We didn't run into any die-hard Germans. But, by the way, this was in Austria. And from there, because I was young and had no responsibilities, they rotated guys back home based on the number of points that they had. Years in service, years overseas, or months, dependents, and so on and so forth. And not having very much of anything, I spent the next several months with an infantry division, the 42nd Infantry Division, and eventually wound up in Vienna as General Mark Clark. Vienna at that time was like Berlin. It was a four powers anyhow. Four powers occupied Vienna, and the French and the Russians and the British and the Americans. And I become part of the honor guard for Mark Clark, who was the commander of all the forces in Austria. And from there I came home. Shipped me home, road train from Vienna clear up to Bremerhaven, Hamburg, and then by boat back to New York, discharged in Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, and finally arrived home. I wasn't sure what I would do when I got home. The first thing I thought was get a job, and which I did. I went to work for the Railway Express and delivering and picking up express all over Helena. And they liked me there, but I told them I was going to go to school. No, at that time I told them I was going to go to work for the highway department because they offered me a job. And this is the funny part. They offered me a job as a computer. When I got there, I found out what a computer was in them days. Now, we're talking about 1946, 47. A computer was a guy who, what they called a dog, and he would dog out the areas of cut and fill off a highway. They would have every 100 feet a cross section, and they'd lay what was to be the new grade on, and then you computed the cut or fill. And now that's all done by computer, of course. But after a few months of doing that, I went to Carroll. Decided I'd better get to school, and went to Carroll under the GI Bill. And but I wanted to be a veterinarian, and so I took a pre-med course, which Carroll, of course, excelled in, and at that time. And at that time, there was just the big main building, which we called the Rock, because it was all stone, and it had dormitories upstairs, and they had the big concrete platform in back, because so many Navy people had gone to Carroll. It was called the Fantail, and that's where you went out to have a smoke. And almost everybody smoked in them days, but the school was real kind to us, because I think between a break in class it was either 10 or 15 minutes, and you could sneak outside and get a smoke. Well, I went to Carroll for 3 semesters and was still in Carroll when I met my first wife, and I got a summer job with the highway after Carroll Spring, and but I worked in the far eastern part of the state, and when I come back, I met my wife, and we decided to get married in the following May, which we did, and I should have went back to school then, but I didn't. I was making a few bucks working for the highway. But to supplement my pay, somebody said to me, they're looking for radio operators, flight radio operators, in the Air Force at the base in Great Falls. And I said, really? And they said, yes, you can join up if you want and pick up a few extra bucks every month. And if you qualify for flight pay, get in, I think, 4 hours a month, you can get flight pay also. Well, so I joined, and it was fun. I became a flight radio operator, and then lo and behold, they called us in, and I moved my family to Great Falls. My daughter Chris was born right after I was called in, and most of my flights it was a military air transport service, and this was during the Korean War, and most of my flights were between Great Falls and Alaska, Fairbanks and Anchorage, and usually back to McCord Field in Tacoma, Washington, and then back to Great Falls. And sometimes it would be the opposite. But in those days, in those big old C-54s, it was an 8-hour flight from Anchorage to Seattle. And I was in the Air Force for a year and was discharged. And that ended my military career. But since then, I went back to the highway, planning and research, and transferred to the newly created traffic engineer section, and stayed with traffic engineers for several years, and become the assistant, but I couldn't qualify to become the assistant in name because I didn't have an engineering degree. So during that time, a job come up in the Planning and Research Bureau, and I applied for that as the assistant there and got it. And I stayed with it for 10 years, and then my boss retired and I became the bureau chief. And I was a bureau chief for about 5 years before I retired. And I retired and lived in Montana City, mostly fooling with horses and playing a little banjo. And that's, my first wife passed away in 2001, and she was only 77. And now I'm here.
Would you mind playing a little bit of banjo for us?
Oh, I can. Let's see. Oh, God, I got it. I gotta get out of here. Now this is a 4-string banjo, which is different. This is a tenor banjo. This is the last of the development of the banjo. The granddaddy, of course, was a 5-string. And then they come up with a plectrum banjo, which is a 4-string, had a longer neck than this one, and the played with a plectrum, and this pick is called a plectrum. I haven't played it much in the past 10 years, and my fingers are so stiff. That I had trouble. Too.
Well, thank you very much for agreeing to do an interview with me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for doing an interview with me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.